who is Nimrod, and how does he still influence the modern world? Do you know what an Egyptian obelisk represents? Is Psalm 104 plagiarized from the prayer to the sun god of Pharaoh Akhenaten? Did Moses really borrow the Ten Commandments from the Egyptian Ma'at? Is the Godhead some call the Trinity borrowed from the Egyptian triad Osiris, Isis, and Horus? And is Christmas a Christian or pagan festival? And why do Christians and Wiccans both celebrate December the 25th together? These are some of the challenges that were first posed by white intellectuals and has now been embraced and has continued with the Black conscious movement, and they will be answered in this study. Just a warning, some of the images some may find offensive. Have you ever been challenged about something you strongly believe in, and it has shaken your faith? I think it is important to be challenged. It should make you examine yourself. But in recent years, I've seen many people inside of the churches getting drawn into the issue of race. And instead of seeking a spiritual solution, they have a carnal response. This study is going to examine the issue of race. It is an area which makes many people feel very uncomfortable, but I like doing studies which challenge people and provoke people's thinking. And this study is going to look at the issue of race and how we can respond to it effectively. This is the remains of a city in an ongoing war in Syria. A country where the Apostle Paul had his conversion experience, and a country where a group who were called the people of that or the way were first called Christians. The earliest Bibles in the East called the Peshitta, which means the simple, started with the Syrian church and became the dominant Bible for the churches in the East from the 5th century to this very day. And it was a country where Christians and Muslims lived side by side in harmony. War is horrible. Innocent civilians die or become internally displaced because of the corporate interests of big players. And these are the images from this drone that most news channels won't show, for it will wake people up to the realities and horrors of war and may strike a discussion on why there is a huge influx of immigrants from that region. In August 2016, the US Central Command admitted that the United States may have played a role in civilian casualties. But in a world where the blood-soaked earth just never dries, it is very clear that the top military and intelligence brass have a deep thirst for seeing more and more innocent blood shed.
We need to make the Iranians pay a price in Syria. We need to make the Russians pay a price. The other thing I would do...
We make them pay the price by killing Russians.
Yes.
And killing Iranians.
Yes. Covertly.
Fear drove many of the big human rights developments over the past year.
I think it's very important to remind our fellow citizens that we need a range of weapons and equipment to respond and protect our fellow citizens and protect ourselves.
Jewish settlers say they're seeking freedom of worship, but Muslims say they're desecrating Al-Aqsa Mosque.
But there is another war taking place that is only talked about in a few lone circles, one that is racial in nature, and it is cleverly being stoked by a hidden hand to divide the races. And disillusionment with the government and an ever-growing divide between the rich and the poor that is growing each day, where the millennials who will never reap the benefits of their parents' hard work and investment is making people in their frustration embrace a racial identity as a sense of pride, while many are unaware on how vast they are growing and how dangerous some of these groups actually are.
If you look at the most scientifically rigorous studies, they all show that the level of violence coming out of the white supremacist movement is often 3 to 5 times higher in an average year than coming from any other group in the United States.
But there are also other groups on the other side of the racial spectrum. They may not be as politically organized as the other ones, but their drive for racial equality is creating an unhealthy atmosphere, and people are sensing that something is going to explode. But there is a group that the narrator saw as insignificant until many made it aware that they were giving Christians a hard time. They are called or known as the Black Hebrew Israelites. They are militant black men who never wear a smile and stand on street corners dressed like they are auditioning for a sci-fi movie and misquote biblical passages to accommodate their racial worldview.
All right? The only people that can be saved are the blacks and Hispanics. Not everybody can be saved. All right? So you don't need this? Well, no, I know the word. We're going to learn who salvation is for. Let's get that. Right? This man asked, how do you get saved? All right? And I just made a statement. I said salvation is only for the blacks and Hispanics. If you're not of Negro descent, Taino Indian descent, Native American descent, this Bible is not for you. You are not going to be saved. Christ did not come for everybody. Right. All right? That's a vain deceit. Yeah. That's another philosophy of this world, mainly America. Right.
This is one of their arguments, but it has to be challenged. Not through skillful intellect, but just using the Bible. Not to embarrass them, but to show them that the God of heaven has a deep interest in all nationalities to become a part of the eternal inheritance. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached where? In all the world for a witness unto," and look at the words highlighted, "all nations, and then shall the end come." The Lord didn't just say it once, he repeated it again in Matthew chapter 28 verses 19 and 20. Jesus said that, "Go ye therefore and teach," and look at the words highlighted, "all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost." So he clearly introduced the Godhead. "Teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." When Jesus was addressing the Hebrew nation of his day, he told them in Matthew chapter 21 and verse 43, "Therefore I say unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof." Who is this nation, and what will they comprise of? A number of years earlier, when the Lord spoke to the patriarch Abraham, at the time known as Abraham, it reads in Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 to 3, "Now the Lord hath said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will shew or show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." And how will that take place? In Galatians chapter 3 verses 28 and 29, it reads, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, no racial or ethnic qualification. There is neither bond nor free, no preferential treatment due to your social status. There is neither male nor female, no priority or favoritism over your gender. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." Paul repeats it over again in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 11, when he said, "Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision or uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all." Another disciple makes it even more airtight. It reads in Acts chapter 10 verses 34 and 35, "Then Peter opened his mouth and said, Of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in," and look at the words highlighted, "every nation, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him." The way God looks at us is completely different how we look at each other. When the prophet Samuel was looking for a king among Jesse's sons, in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7 it reads, "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, that is his face, nor on the height of his stature, that is how tall he is, because I have refused him. And observing the words highlighted, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh upon the heart. When you open the Bible, starting with the book of Genesis, though different nations and tribes are mentioned in the 10th chapter, God reminds us that he hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. And reading down all the way to Revelation, the overall message is God trying to plead and restore mankind back into the image of God. But it also records kings from 3 different continents, and this shows that the Bible not only teaches redemption, but it can be read and relied upon as a timeless, historically accurate document. The continent of Africa has been misrepresented as insignificant, contributing nothing to human civilization. But the Bible has preserved 3 of its kings. Pharaoh Shishonk I, known in the Bible as Shishak, was of Libyan descent. He founded the 22nd dynasty of Egypt and is first mentioned in the Bible as offering an asylum in Egypt for Jeroboam, who was being pursued to death by King Solomon. Shishak later invaded Jerusalem and was successful as a result of the apostasy of King Rehoboam. Pharaoh Necho or Necho II was a king of the 26th dynasty of Egypt and was known as working on a huge construction project according to Herodotus. When warring against the king of Assyria, he defeated and slew Josiah, king of Judah, at the Battle of Megiddo. Necho was eventually defeated by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. But the most successful of those 3 pharaohs was King Taharka, who was from the Sudan. Only of recent have some scholars chronicled him as one of Egypt's greatest kings. He was the most famous of the black pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, where he formed an alliance with King Hezekiah of Judah, and his military endeavors hindered the progress of the Assyrian army defeating the kingdom of Judah. Taharka is not only recorded on Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in the book of Isaiah, the most preserved of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in 1947. But he wasn't the only heathen king mentioned in that book. There were others. The portion of Asia called the Near East was once dominated by the Assyrians of northern Iraq, a brutal people who were later humbled by the preaching of Jonah. In the 19th century, the British Museum introduced the archaeological science of Assyriology, and kings who were once seen as mythological figures were now proven to be real individuals who once left a deep impact on the ancient world. The first Assyrian king recorded by the prophet Isaiah was Sargon II. He was apparently the founder of the last Neo-Assyrian dynasty, and he is adorned in the Assyrian mitre, robes and scepter, a symbol of his authority. He was succeeded by his son Sennacherib, an Assyrian king who threatened King Hezekiah of Judah, invaded Lachish and cursed God. He was later killed by 2 of his sons and was succeeded by his other son Esarhaddon, the 3rd Assyrian king mentioned by the prophet Isaiah, with his father and grandfather, and on display in the British Museum. In the New Testament, the kings of Europe began to dominate the world stage, and 3 kings of the Roman Empire are recorded by the writers of the Gospels and the book of Acts. These 2 rare books record the life of a famous soldier turned emperor and reformer, who created order out of chaos and turned a republic into an empire. In the British Museum is an image of Caius Octavius, who was given the title of Augustus Caesar. He renamed the Roman month Sextilis after himself, and to this day we still call it August. In front of him is a bust of his successor, Tiberius Caesar, the 2nd emperor of the Roman Empire, who contemporary historians Pliny the Elder described as the saddest of men, and Tacitus calls a mixture of good and bad. It was during the reign of these 2 Caesars that Christ was born in Bethlehem and died at Calvary. And during the reign of Tiberius' successor, Claudius Caesar, is when the early apostolic church was born in the Near or Middle East and started to grow within the Roman Empire. And when you go through the Bible, race is just not there as an issue as it is today for a generation that foolishly claims that it is evolving in enlightenment and wisdom. But let us spend a bit more time on race, for there are groups who have a strange notion that one is better than the other, and the narrator wants to prove that it is all just nonsense. This painting by Charles Marion Russell, known as the Cowboy Artist, shows Captain Meriwether Lewis and Second Lieutenant William Clark seated on the left, descendants of European immigrants, who are surrounded by the Native American tribe, the Mandan, who are situated along the upper Missouri River in North Dakota that borders the United States and Canada. They are fascinated and intrigued with the jet black skin of the African American slave explorer, York, who thought that his skin was magical and had to touch it to see if it was real, for they suspect him of supernatural origin. Though these three peoples of African, European, and Native American descent are polar miles apart, they all at one time practice the same custom. Their forefathers and descendants reshaped their skulls, a practice that has been called artificial cranial deformation. In London's Ripley Museum, there are some very rare oddities, for its founder enjoyed exploring rare things about humanity. This skull is from Peru in South America, but it doesn't look like an ordinary skull. It is very elongated and looks very, very weird indeed. The Peruvians' distant relatives in North America also practice artificial cranial deformation. Why you'd want to shape your child's head like a watermelon is a mystery to the narrator. But it wasn't just the Americas. These photos are of a bust of the 14th century BC Egyptian queen Nefertiti that the narrator took at the Egyptian Museum in Berlin a number of years ago. She looks very attractive with a slender face. But on a side view of this bust, her crown looks quite big at the back, and you're wondering why does her head at the back look so big? When you see this carving of her husband, Pharaoh Akhenaten, on the left, and see what her head looks like on the right, she also seems to have had artificial cranial deformation performed on her as a child. And this is still practiced among some tribes in Africa, especially in the Congo. The Mangbetu people have preserved the practice of elongating their skulls kind of up until the 1950s. Yes, it is weird, but it is their practice. Like the Native Americans, they would get a baby, then wrap its head in some type of cloth and elongate it. And this tradition continued for years. European explorers were intrigued by this practice in the 19th century, called Lipombo, where the infant's head was shaped in a latitudinal way. But many Europeans were unaware that their early forebears practiced it also from early antiquity, and it still existed in France right into the 20th century. It was in the region of Toulouse in France that artificial cranial deformation continued well into the 20th century, at the same time as the Mangbetu of the Congo. And no matter how hard one race thinks of itself as superior, they at one time all practiced the same thing. This is the skull of an early European in London's Natural History Museum. And when you check out the skull of a man from the Middle East in Asia, that is alongside another skull from a man in Kenya in East Africa, you take off all the layers, mankind is just the same. Each culture depicted their distinct facial features in their art, like these copper faces from Nigeria with distinct African features, and this metal caricature from ancient Greece with unique Southern European features, and the Assyrians with their thick Near East noses, long hair and facial beard have their own distinctness about them. And as you carefully look at the distinct features of different groups from all over the globe, yes, they do all have their own distinct look and are all beautiful within themselves. None can claim any level of superiority over another. It's just nonsense. The ancient Greeks depicted black Africans in their art with no biases, and the Nigerians also depicted the Portuguese Europeans in their art in the 15th and 16th century. And when you study the ancient world, race was not an issue. People were not going on about their melanin or their different color or shades of eyes. But today, in the 21st century, race is an issue. And if you think these are ignorances from isolated communities, influential people in both politics and music are pushing for racial superiority. It's sad, but it's a reality.
And I love European culture and civilization. I consider it to be the greatest civilization this planet has ever produced. And we are all products, or most of us here are products of that civilization. And it is a fantastic thing.
And they ain't gonna fall to the wayside. They're gonna take their street smarts and run the world. Cause the black man is God. And no way out too, that's how I'm gonna leave it on you. Peace.
The first time a man was taught that he was a god, lower caps, was when he rejected the word of the Almighty God and embraced the self-worship philosophy of the father of lies in Eden, the dragon, that old serpent which is the devil and Satan. And the black conscious movement has embraced this philosophy, naively believing that it is unique to the black race, when it can be traced to all false teachings in every culture all over the world. And many are fighting down the Bible and encouraging people to go back to the pagan idolatry of ancient Egypt, then contradicting themselves by quoting the same Bible they reject to validate their own history.
I was born and raised in Chicago. I grew up in a Christian household. My grandmother was probably the most religious person I ever met in my life. She took me to church, and every time I went to church, I would ask questions. Yeah. Why don't I see people who look like me in the Bible? Mm-hmm. Why, and I asked, and she would say, just don't ask questions.
Yeah, like my mom did.
And so that developed in me an inquisitive mind. And I might add, since we talked earlier about Christianity in the Bible, Karakamun's uncle, Shabaka was his father. Karakamun's uncle, Taharka, is the only African king, only African pharaoh mentioned by name in the Bible. And the reason that is because Taharka, when he was the ruler of Kemet and Kush, ruled at that time the largest empire in the world, and he protected Jerusalem from the Assyrians. So that's why in the Jewish text, they acknowledge this African king who saved their nation.
Halfway through the interview, he said there is no black representation in the Bible. Then he mentions King Taharka, an African king, near the end of the interview. Then in another portion of the interview, he unconsciously follows a Jesuit tactic, attacking one of the greatest gifts to British Protestantism.
That the version of the Bible today, and now for many decades, that is the one that is most often referred to, is the one that was written, commissioned by King James. The reason why I asked you earlier, were you talking about someone in particular, because you talked about a murderer and a rapist and a whole bunch of other characteristics that weren't so flattering.
Yes.
I thought you might have mentioned King James then. Tell us about King James, the writer, the commissioner, the author of the book that so many Christians today read.
He was a murderer, and he wanted to have a book, his own version of the Bible, that would allow him to engage his subjects in the manner that he wanted to and still be looked upon favorably by God. And so
one of the world's greatest novelists, Russian author, reformer, and moral thinker Leo Tolstoy, famously said, "When judging other people's shortcomings, remember yours." Scottish monarch James Stuart, King James VI of Scotland and King James I of England, has received an unfair posthumous grilling with a distortion of historical facts in modern times. There was not a monarch in that time period whose life was unpolished, and at times he was given to tyranny. But the secular radar homes in on this one monarch, and as the famous saying goes, anytime you want to hide information from black people, just put it in a book. And the black conscious community, so-called respected intellectuals, hijacks arguments from the white community as theirs, presents it to naive blacks, then it becomes to them gospel. Scotsman James Aiken Wiley, in his 19th century historical classic, History of Protestantism, in Volume 3, gives the most balanced account of King James's life. Wiley documents that King James' earliest tutor, George Buchanan, on the left, instructed the young king in the principles of religious and civil liberty, and Geneva educator Sir Peter Young, on the right, educated the king in the principles of Protestantism. But the king from early fell under the spell of his father's cousin, the Franco-Scotsman Esme Stuart, the first Earl of Lennox, who many rumoured that King James had homosexual feelings for, who taught James the divine right of kings and all absolute power was vested in the monarch. But did King James author, write, and translate the Bible as these two men assert? Let us check the facts. In Richmond upon Thames in Greater London, England, is the famous Hampton Court Palace. When King James came from Scotland to England to replace Queen Elizabeth I, he was handed the famous Millenary Petition, a document presented to the king by the Puritans on how they wanted to see the church reformed. The staff at the palace do not know much about the history of King James, but in a book titled A History of Conferences and Other Proceedings, it actually has the official documents of the day at what took place in Hampton Court Palace concerning the 1611 Authorized Version. It reads, "On the 14th day of January in the year 1604, the first conference was held in the palace of Hampton Court in the presence of the King and the Lords of the Privy Council. Upon Monday His Majesty appointed certain of the best learned of the precisest sort to be before him in the Privy Chamber to hear what they could object. Dr. Reynolds moved His Majesty that there might be a new translation of the Bible, because those which were allowed in the reign of King Henry VIII and Edward VI were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original." So from the official historical documents of the day, it was Dr. John Reynolds, a Puritan, the head of the Corpus Christi College at the University of Oxford, who recommended that a new translation of the Bible should be introduced to the English people to be read. And this has been confirmed by Wikipedia, that says that John Reynolds is remembered for his role in the Authorized Version of the Bible, a project of which he was the initiator, not King James. From attacking the Bible, the Black Conscious Movement now ridiculously claims that its content is borrowed from the culture of the ancient Egyptians.
And so it is from the 42 admonitions of Ma'at that Moses derived the 10 Commandments. And so there is a profound difference between an admonition of Ma'at, where one declares your innocence and says, I have not done X, Y, and Z, and a commandment where people without a profound understanding of Ma'at must be commanded not to do things that a person in their right mind would know not to do.
Let us carefully analyze the culture and religion of Egypt. No other nation preserved its history with such precision like this North African culture. They were very detailed, but they put their Agan into pagan idolatry. Everything that the human eye could see was turned into a god, where they worshipped and served the creature more than the creator, where they fell prostrate and bowed down to these man-made deities. Crocodiles, lions, cats. They even worship the cat in a dress that's ridiculous. This is a culture that many are running back to, not fully realizing what they practiced. And when you analyze the beliefs of this culture, it is absolutely ridiculous. A number of years ago, the narrator was in regular heated debates and discussions at college with a man who was a follower of a former US R&B singer, Dwight York, who is in the center of this photo. This self-proclaimed charlatan made many false claims by calling himself the Lamb. And as you can read in the bottom left, Melchizedek, but he cleverly called himself Malachi Zadok. Anyone who calls himself the Lamb is in blasphemy. But he also viewed himself as a pharaoh, and like many in the Black Conscious Movement, they take what they want from the Bible to accommodate their own worldview. In Atlanta, Georgia, he tried to recreate his own Egyptian paradise, and he had quite a huge following when he was at his peak of self-delusionment. And the narrator just knew this man was a blatant scam artist. He was later jailed for molesting not just girls, but also boys, which many of his followers see as a smear campaign. But in 1997, the narrator purchased one of their books, scroll number 154, and it was adorned with the pagan idolatry of Egypt and the belief in UFOs and aliens, which was fundamental to the group known as the Nubians. Its ideology penetrated into the hip-hop culture, with the Atlanta-based group Outkast on their album Ekumani incorporated the Nubian philosophy with its Egyptian symbols and UFOs. When the narrator used to come from church and watch Yo MTV Raps on a Saturday evening, the Outcast video on elevators would come on regularly, incorporating the Nubian philosophy of Dwight York, where they taught a generation of young men that they are from Egypt and that they are descendants of aliens. Also remember that 75% of rap music is brought by white males, so all cultures were affected. And if you think this is just a one-off video from hip-hop, English film director Ridley Scott also did the same thing in the film Prometheus, that taught that we must go back to the religion of Egypt, where we will discover that we are not created by God, but aliens called the engineers. And as the narrator has observed black consciousness or New Age philosophy, it is all the same thing. The human heart does not want to recognize God, but continues to embrace the lie at Eden. Let's go back to Egypt again. So the Egyptians would worship the scarab beetle. They were some of the most dominant of all the imagery in ancient Egypt, but why? A painting in a coffin at the top shows a scarab just under the sun. You see, the scarab beetle would roll elephant's dung and lay their eggs in it. But the Egyptians, in their superstition, believed that the dung was the sun god being rolled across the heavens. I'd like to ask you a question. Would you really want to go back to the worship of an animal that rolls doo-doo or dung? Many of the Black conscious movement is running to India, for they see the ancient Egyptian religion still preserved within that culture. The 19th century English Egyptologist Sir John Gardner Wilkinson says, if there is any connection between the two religions of Egypt and India, this must be ascribed to the period before the two races left Central Asia. Many may argue about the geography of the two races, but this was one of the most highly revered deities in ancient Egypt, the bull or cow god, and it has the sun disk on its head to show that it represents the sun. This is one on display in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. But in the British Museum and Victoria and Albert Museum in London, England, you can also see images of the cow who was and still is revered and worshipped in India. In early dynastic Egypt, the cow was worshipped even to the time when Egypt was under Greco-Roman rule. And this still continues today in India, where they also see the cow as sacred and pray and worship the cow, and some even drink its urine, believing it can cure and give prosperous health. And the biggest humiliation to God was when the children of Israel worshipped this same cow god called Apis. They made a calf in Horeb and worshipped the molten image. Thus they changed their glory into the similitude of an ox that eateth grass. Because of Egypt's idolatry, God prophesied its moral and spiritual decline. When I shall make the land of Egypt desolate, and the country shall be destitute of that whereof it was full, when I shall smite all them that dwell therein, then shall they know that I am the Lord. The central worship of Egypt was the sun, Ra. And when people say that the Israelites borrowed from Egypt, it is very clear that they have no idea what they are talking about. Then said he unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and, behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshipped the sun toward the east. And God called sun worship an abomination. This is also verified in the book of the patriarch Job. He said, If I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in brightness, and my heart hath been secretly enticed, or my mouth has kissed my hand, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge, for I should have denied the God that is above. So sun worship is both an iniquity and an abomination in the sight of God, and it is very strange when higher critics say that Pharaoh Akhenaten's prayer to the sun god, the Aten, is what inspired Psalms 104, when the very psalm in verse 19 praises God who made the sun. The very role of a pharaoh was the belief that he was a physical embodiment and representation of the sun god. English Egyptologist Sir John Gardner Wilkinson said in his exhaustive work, "The king was to them the representative of the deity, his name Phra or Pharaoh signifying the sun, pronounce him the emblem of the god of light, and his royal authority was directly derived from the gods." So how can anyone in their right mind believe that the 10 Commandments is from Ma'at when the first 4 teaches to stay far away from pagan idolatry? The best commentator on the 10 Commandments summarizes and simplifies what it is and what it embodies. In Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 to 40, it reads, "Master, which is the great commandment in the law?" Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." This has been seconded by another authority. In Romans chapter 13 verses 9 and 10 it reads, "For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." A third witness says, "If you fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, ye do well." So both Jesus, Paul, and James summarize the 10 Commandments law as being embodied in love. And the best way to ease racial tensions is by following that divine principle, selfless love to your fellow man and love to God who made you. If followed, this will solve world conflicts, end gang warfare, tribal disputes, domestic abuse, no neighborhood watch, no rapists, no jihadists, and no need for a G20, G8, or a World Summit or the United Nations. But the Black Conscious Movement continues its attacks.
Right now I want to stay with Christianity and the Holy Trinity. So many centuries ago, thousands of years ago, Isis, Horus, and Osiris were thought of as a Holy Trinity. By whom?
By the Greeks. The names Isis, Horus, and Osiris are Greek names. They're Greek names for African personalities.
In London's British Museum, in the Egyptian section, are some artifacts with the images engraved on them of Isis, Horus, and Osiris, which many have claimed the Godhead in the Bible is borrowed from. The ancient Egyptians used to worship these deities, but for many people, Christian and non-Christian, they struggle to understand the Godhead, which some call the Trinity. You can only understand it by following this divine principle. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, it says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must, number 1, believe that he is, and that, number 2, he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." Romans chapter 10 and verse 17 tells us how we can acquire that faith. "So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God." To understand the Godhead, let's just stick to the wording of the Bible, no private interpretation. Matthew chapter 3 verses 16 and 17 says, "And Jesus, when he was baptized, went straightway out of the water, and, lo, the heavens were opened unto him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove, and alighting upon him. And a voice from heaven saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Jesus introduces the Godhead, showing that they are all one and work in conjunction with each other. In John chapter 14 and verse 26, the Lord says, "But the Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things, and bring all things to your remembrance, whatsoever I have said unto you." Jesus repeats it over again, as previously quoted in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 19. The Lord says, "Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." So Jesus shows that all three are God and work together in redemption, but they also work with each other in creation. In Genesis chapter 1 verses 1, 2 and 26 it reads, "In the beginning, God," which is the English translation of the Hebrew word Elohim, plural, "created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God, Elohim again, said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." When the Elohim said us, who spoke it into existence? When John was writing about Jesus Christ's deity in John chapter 1 verses 1 to 3, he said, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." One of the first Westerners to claim that the Christian Godhead was borrowed from the Egyptian triads was 17th century Ralph Cudworth, who was the leading systematic philosopher among the Cambridge Platonists. But his argument was refuted by John Lorenz von Moschim, the German Lutheran Church historian, professor at Helmstedt and chancellor at the University of Göttingen, who was the first church historian to advocate the treatment of original sources from an objective and critical standpoint. This 2-volume set book, The History of Ancient Egypt, refutes the argument and shows where it came from. And George Rawlinson says, "It has been supposed by some that the Egyptian esoteric religion comprised a recognition of the fact first made known to mankind distinctly by Christianity, that the divine nature is a trinity in unity." In the 17th century, Cudworth strongly supported this view, and in modern times, the Black Conscious movement, it has been favoured by some of those who are opposed to the doctrine and desirous of tracing it to a merely human origin. But the grounds upon which Cudworth rested his belief were long ago examined and refuted by Moschim, who showed in the first place that the authority on whom the English divine relied was untrustworthy, and in the second that he did not make the assertion which was ascribed to him. Modern investigation of the religious books and inscriptions of Egypt confirmed the view of Moschim. For though the local worship of the country triads were very numerous, there is not the slightest indication of the Egyptians having possessed any such conception as that of a trinity in unity. The Supreme Being was viewed as in his essence absolutely one, and when divided up was divided not into three, but into a multitude of aspects. The triads are not groups of persons, but of attributes. The three are not co-equal, but distinctly the reverse, the third in the triad being always subordinate. Nor is the division regarded as in any case exhausted of the divine nature or exclusive of other divisions. The doctrine of the Trinity is thus in no sense an Egyptian doctrine, and it is quite fanciful to suppose that it even, in any sense, grew out of the Egyptian affection for triads. The doctrine, as has been frequently shown, underlies the most ancient portions of the Pentateuch, and is most reasonably regarded as involved in that primeval revelation which God vouchsafed to our first parents in paradise. So the black conscious arguments trying to compare Egypt to Christianity is borrowed from whites and has no foot to stand on, but they still make more claims.
Now, according to some versions of the story, Heru was born 6,000 years ago on December the 25th. So we have, within the story of the founding Paris of ancient Kemet, Osiris and Heru, the fundamental story that would later be incorporated into the Bible as the story of Jesus. And
most of the Black Conscious Movement arguments are borrowed from a 2-volume set book called The Natural Genesis, a book that has been discredited by nearly all academics for its lack of data. Gerald Macy claimed that all Western religions can trace their origins to Egypt, and the arguments from the black community are just borrowed from the white community. Gerald Macy says in Volume 2, the supposed historical Christ had no other birthday than that of the solar god. The divine child was born in the winter solstice, December the 25th, the date assigned to the birth of the sun god Mithras and to Horus the child in Egypt. As scholars have studied the ancient catacombs of Rome, they have found no inscriptions of the god Mithras that said he was born on the 25th of December. That's a myth. And there is still no papyri, manuscript or hieroglyph from Egypt that says that Horus was also born on December the 25th. Now it was a pagan festival, but they can't be traced to these two gods. And when you open up the Bible, can anyone cite one passage of the Holy Scriptures where the writers, Jesus, or the disciples mentioned the date of Jesus' birth and taught others to observe it? There is no scripture reference for it because it is not in the Bible. So those who have tried to link Jesus with Horus, there is no evidence. But most of the Christians of today still celebrate the sun god on December the 25th. And if you ask them where in the Bible is it found, they get very, very defensive because they enjoy it. And most Christians of today, unfortunately, are not Bible-based. And the reason why scholars are saying that Christianity is fake, cheap, phony, and no different to paganism is not because of what the Bible says, but because of what Christians do. In the Huffington Post, it records how Courtney Weber, a Wiccan priestess, tarot advisor, and teacher with a pentagram around her neck, and Lisa Anderson, a Christian theologian and social justice activist, are friends and co-workers who both celebrate December the 25th. Now, if Christians never practiced these pagan holidays, secular critics would not have a foot to stand on. But because Christians have borrowed so many of their customs from pagans, they are constantly being challenged.
Black Madonna. The Black Madonna is the Greek version of Isis and Horus, which is the Europeanized version of Heru and Aset.
Westminster Cathedral in London, England is the mother of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. At the top in the centre are two flags. On the right is the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom, and on the left flies the flag of the Vatican City-State, known as the flag of the Holy See. When you walk inside the church, you see the most iconic image in Catholic churches around the world, the mother and child. These images can also be found in Russian Orthodox churches. And as you go through Catholic churches and museums in London, England, you continue to see this dominant carving or painting of the mother and child. And secular critics use this imagery as a weapon that Christianity is a continuation of paganism. The current Pope Francis I also gives homage to this image and calls it Mary and Jesus. But would these images be seen in the early Apostolic Church? Not at all. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 29 it reads, "For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold, or silver, or stone, graven by art and man's devices." The early church did not display graven images at all. But what about the worship of Mary? Jesus destroyed that from very early. And it came to pass, as he spake these things, a certain woman of the company lifted up her voice, and said unto him, Blessed is the womb that bare thee, and the paps or breasts which thou hast sucked, in Luke chapter 11 and verse 27. But Jesus diverted very quickly any hint of Mary worship and responded. But he said, yea, rather, or instead of praising Mary, blessed are they that hear the word of God and keep it. Luke chapter 11 and verse 28. In London's British Museum, that houses some of the best artifacts in the world, we get a background of where the mother and child imagery comes from, and it is not from the apostles, it is from paganism. A mother and child from ancient Babylon in the Near East in Asia. And in the Far East, they also worship in some parts the mother and child. The most famous and dominant images are in Egypt, in North Africa. And it was also worshipped in Greece, in southern Europe. And it is clear once again that all cultures at one time, no matter what race they were, practiced the same thing. So when did it get incorporated into the church? This mother and child image in Knightsbridge, London, is above a statue of the Anglican convert to Catholicism. His name was Cardinal John Henry Newman, and he tells us when these mother and child images were adopted. We are told in various ways by Eusebius that Constantine, in order to recommend the new religion to the heathen, transferred into it the outward ornaments to which they had been accustomed in their own. He then gives a list. The use of temples and these dedicated to particular saints, incense, lamps and candles, holy water, holy days, processions, the ring in marriage, turning to the east, images at a later date, are all of pagan origin and sanctified by their adoption into the church. So it was Emperor Constantine who incorporated all the pagan idolatry into the church, and the Catholic Church openly tells us that all of her paraphernalia and iconic images are from paganism. And because the Black Conscious Movement's followers do not read, and have not sought what God's holy word actually says for themselves, they are now going back to the pagan idolatry of Egypt, and celebrities are very influential at starting trends. But it is quite obvious that these men and women do not truly understand the depth and spiritual darkness and idolatry of the ancient Egyptian culture. Yes, they were very advanced and invented and carved monolithic structures that still baffles modern architects and engineers. But if you were to challenge them on some of the ancient practices, they would have no part of it. But there are many who are pushing for it, naively believing that it will greatly enlighten them.
And the most obvious symbol of the capital of the wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history is an object that is known as the Washington Monument.
Yes.
It stands in the geographical center of what was originally the 10-mile square of the capital of the United States of America. Now that symbol is an ancient African symbol which represents the resurrection of an African king named Asar, whose name was later changed by the Greeks to Osiris. So that symbol is the oldest symbol of resurrection known to man. And I might add, Rock, that symbol was developed in Africa, principally in Kemet, the country that the Greeks renamed Egypt. That symbol is over 6,000 years old. And it represents a man, Asar, who was the founding father of Kemet, the nation of the black people.
The obelisk, known as the Washington Monument, is the world's tallest stone structure and the world's tallest obelisk, standing 554 feet tall in height. But what does an obelisk actually represent? In a book titled The Phallus, it documents the global worship in every pre-Christian culture, even to modern times, of the male's sexual organ by a French-born historian, dancer, musicologist and convert to Hinduism, Alain Danielou. And this is what he documents in his thesis. The cult of the phallus has survived in India, can be discerned throughout not only the civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Middle East, Egypt and the Aegean, but also those of Thrace, Italy and the entire pre-Celtic world, including Ireland. The Egyptian obelisk is a phallic symbol. The same is true of steeples and minarets of later religions during their earliest manifestations. Christian church steeples represent the phallus. Minarets alongside Muslim mosques also represent the phallus, and the design can be traced to the Egyptian obelisk, the oldest phallic symbol in architecture. In India, the god Shiva's head is carved into a phallus. And as you walk in London's British Museum, you see that the Romans had rings with phalluses carved on them as a sign of good luck. They also had chains with a phallus. In ancient Babylon, they worshipped the phallus, and the artifact in the bottom right from Nubia, Sudan, showed that they also worshipped the phallus. And in Egypt, Sudan's northern neighbor, men and women would fall down prostrate and actually pray to Osiris's phallus, which the obelisk represents. In India, they also pray to Shiva's phallus in temples, a continuation of the Egyptian religion, and it is also practiced in Japan as a sign of fertility. In England, they perform maypole dancing. The pole represents the phallus and fertility, where it is always women who you see dancing around the pole or phallus. And in Ethiopia, the dead corpse of a Konso leader tied to a pole has a phallus tied around his head, where close friends and relatives spend nights and give homage by singing praises to him. In Ethiopia, they also carve huge obelisks, and on a close inspection of those that have fallen, they, even more than the ones in Egypt, are carved at the top in the form of a man's phallus. And the narrator will say over again that all cultures at one time practice the same pagan idolatry. And this is what black intellectuals are bragging about, that they were the originators of phallic worship. And this is a sad but slow decline back into nature worship and spiritualism. And Egypt always seems to be the model. This artifact from the 19th dynasty of Egypt shows an individual worshipping their ancestors. What is ancestor worship, and where does it come from? On a road called Riding House Street in the city of Westminster in London, England, once lived a former African slave who purchased his freedom. His name was Olaudah Equiano, whose campaigning is what paved the way for the abolition of slavery within the British Empire. This Igbo of Nigeria, in his autobiography, records his early childhood, his former African beliefs before his conversion to Christ, and talks about the origin of ancestor worship in his culture of Nigeria. I regard myself as a particular favourite of heaven and acknowledge the mercies of Providence in every occurrence of my life. I was a Protestant of the Church of England, agreeable to the 39 Articles of that church. By free grace I was persuaded that I had a part and lot in the first resurrection. So he believed that when he died, he would rise in the first resurrection at the second coming of Christ. As to religion, the natives of his native Nigeria believe that there is one creator of all things and that he lives in the sun worship. But as for the doctrine of eternity, I do not remember to have ever heard of it. Some, however, believe in the transmigration of souls in a certain degree. Those spirits which are not transmigrated, such as our dear friends or relations, they believe always attend them and guard them from the bad spirits of their foes. Libation is made by pouring out a small portion of the drink on the floor and tossing a small quantity of the food in a certain place for the spirits of departed relations, which the natives suppose to preside over their conduct and guard them from evil. Ancestor worship is the belief that you are still in contact with your dead relatives, and it's not just in Africa. In Asia, especially the Far East, they also have practiced ancestor worship from antiquity to this day. And in ancient Europe, this Greek soldier has a staff on a serpent in the bottom left, which was believed was his ancestor. In ancient Rome, they had household shrines called alarium, with the two serpents at the bottom dedicated to the ancestors. And Caesar Augustus introduced ancestor worship to ancient Rome, and when his stepfather Julius Caesar died, a comet appeared in the heavens where they believed Julius was now admitted to the company of the gods. And Augustus made a god out of him, a custom called apotheosis. hero worship or ancestor worship, and the 5th Roman month Quintilis was renamed Julius or July. If you were around in the 1980s, the children's animation called Thundercats were about feline superheroes who always looked for advice from their dead overseer called Jaga, another form of ancestor worship. And famous people like Angelina Jolie said that her dead mother is helping her to bring up her children. And Hillary Clinton, according to some media accounts, has channeled the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt, the same ancestor worship. And Hollywood, through horror films like Ouija, promotes contacting the dead, a practice known as necromancy, communicating to the dead through the channeling of different letters on a board. And a film came out called White Noise, starring Michael Keaton, which was about a man trying to contact his dead wife after she died. And the narrator wants to say over again, all the races and cultures at one time all practiced the same thing. It may be titled differently, but it's still the same.
Electronic voice phenomenon, EVP, is the process by which the dead, through sound and image, communicate with the living through the static and white noise of modern electronic devices.
On the official website of the film White Noise, it gives a historical background of the so-called modern occult practice, electronic voice phenomenon, and it records an experience in 1952 of 2 Catholic priests who said that they heard their father talking back to them over a recording of a Gregorian chant, and their findings were endorsed by Pope Pius XII. The English singer Rita Ora sings for the Vatican for the vigil and canonization or sainthood of Mother Teresa, which goes back to the ancient Roman practice of apotheosis that teaches you can pray to the dead, which is fully in line with Roman Catholic teaching. For in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it actually teaches the pagan teaching of ancestor worship, the belief that you can pray to the dead. It reads, communion with the dead. In full consciousness of this communion of the whole mystical body of Jesus Christ, the Church in its pilgrim members from the very earliest days of the Christian religion has honored with great respect of the memory of the dead. And because it is a holy and wholesome thought to pray for the dead, that they may be loosed from their sins, she offers her suffrage for them. Our prayers for them is capable not only of helping them, but also making of their intercession for us effective. The narrator is opposed to any form of ancestor worship or contacting the dead, whether it be in Africa or the Vatican, for we are not in communion with dead relatives, but with demons. And the Bible is totally separate from the teachings of all pagan cultures, where in Isaiah chapter 38 and verse 18 it reads, for the grave cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee, they that go down into the pit cannot hope for thy truth. So praying for them is in vain. And in Hebrews 9:27 it also reads, and as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. So how was human life brought into existence, and what happens at death? And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7. So dust and breath equals a living soul. So what happens at death? Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7. In London's Golders Green Crematorium, among these death plaques, the last half of that text is on display, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. But what is the spirit that returns unto God? Job chapter 27 and verse 3 reads, all the while my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. So the spirit which returns to God is the breath that the Lord breathed into the nostrils of man. There is a reason why the narrator is strongly adamant against ancestor worship and communion with the dead. For when you are dead, you are dead. And if you see anything resembling a relative you have just buried, it is not them. For the Bible is unequivocally clear in Job chapter 7 verses 9 and 10. As the cloud is consumed and vanisheth away, so he that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more. This is seconded by another witness. For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything, neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love, and their hatred, and their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. When God separated the children of Israel from all the other nations, especially pagan Egypt, any form of contacting the dead was totally forbidden. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9, 10, 11, it reads, When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or his daughter pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. So witchcraft and necromancy, which is contacting the dead, was forbidden by God. And when you read Galatians chapter 5, verses 19, 20, and 21, witchcraft is ranked among one of the lusts of the flesh, with other aspects of fallen human nature. But there has been a new desired interest in this art. The Concise English Dictionary mentions voodoo, a belief in religious witchcraft as prevailed among West Indian Negroes, and at the bottom it says where these West Indians inherited it from, Dahomey, that is now called Benin in West Africa. This voodoo or Vodun priest of Benin in West Africa stands next to a door of a temple that is dedicated to the reptile he has around his neck, the serpent or this python. It is the python temple that is revered by most or half of the 9 million people of this former French colony in West Africa, where most of its beliefs are derived from the Yoruba people of Nigeria, where this voodoo temple in Benin also has on its walls the Hindu gods that also reveres the serpent with this voodoo priestess. The Benin culture has also received its blessings by the Vatican's former CEO, Pope Benedict XVI. You may wonder, why does the Church of Rome endorse voodoo? We shall see why in a moment. But voodoo or Vodun is still going strong among the descendants of Benin in the former French colony in Haiti, in the Caribbean. And the narrator has learned that there are many African and Caribbean descendants who are still practicing it even within sight of the black churches in the United Kingdom. Why is there this sudden interest in voodoo? There is a reason. Francois Dominique Toussaint-Louverture was the leader of the Haitian Revolution, where black African slaves rose up and defeated white Europeans and created the first black republic. In Jamaica, the descendants of black African slaves, who were called the Maroons, also rose up and defeated the British. But what did both the Haitians and Jamaicans rely on to defeat the Europeans? In the London Guardian, it recorded that Toussaint Louverture defeated Britain, France, and Spain to create a country free from slavery. Like most Haitians today, Louverture was a voodoo saint or adept of voodoo, a peaceful creed that marries Catholicism with African animism. Most historians agree that Haiti's slaves first rose up in rebellion under a Jamaican voodoo priest named Boukman. On the night of August 15, 1791, Boukman called on the spirits of ancestral Africa to punish the plantocracy. Louverture is said to have taken part in this ceremony, and within 6 weeks the island's rebel slave armies had begun their 12-year struggle for freedom. That night 1,000 French whites were reportedly massacred and their plantations set ablaze. So when studying at least West Indian voodoo, all roads lead to Rome. And when Pope Benedict XVI had a meeting at Assisi in 2011 for world peace, he invited many of the world's religious leaders to pray to their gods that included Professor Wande Abimbola, a Yoruba from Nigeria who was second from right from Pope Benedict XVI, who prayed to Olokun, the Nigerian god of the sea, nature worship. And the reason so many blacks are running back to voodoo, juju and obia is because as they believe that these ancestral spirits, which are really demons from Africa, defeated the white man, they believe that they can depend upon them again to be successful in life. And entertainment, which others call edutainment, has a way of glamorizing this occult witchcraft pagan practice. What you may not know is that when the narrator was at college and at university, there are many white people who are also deeply into the witchcraft practice of voodoo, where it has driven a lot of the modern musical trends that includes jazz, from the voodoo heartland of America, New Orleans.
Voodoo in itself is neither good nor bad. It's a power. Voodoo actually took people out of slavery into freedom, out of the ordinary into the extraordinary.
Voodoo is a direct connection with the spirits. You don't have the intermediary of scripture. You don't separate sacred from secular in voodoo. You don't separate religion from recreation. Voodoo doesn't have a certain day or a certain place, so it's universal. Jazz is voodoo. The object of a New Orleans voodoo ceremony is to become possessed. You induce possession by dancing.
When you go through possession experience, it's an expansion that's almost indescribable, that you go beyond the borders of your own identity. You can get outside of yourself and experience the world from a completely different perspective.
The serpent is central to voodoo, but it was also central to the religion of ancient Egypt, and it was also in ancient Babylon. And the cultures of Mesoamerica in Mexico also revered the serpent. But what race introduced it to these cultures? In the previous study, it was shown that this incense burner from the Sudan was discovered by Western archaeologists. It looks insignificant, but on a close inspection, what was discovered is that the Sudan, according to the New York Times in 1979, had the world's oldest monarchy, not in Egypt, but in a culture much further down the Nile. The majestic figure on the incense burner, Dr. Williams said, is the earliest known representation of a king in the Nile Valley. His name is unknown, but he is believed to have lived approximately 3 generations of kings before the time of Scorpion, the earliest known Egyptian ruler. The new findings suggest that the ancient Nubians may have reached a stage of political development as long ago as 3300 BC, several generations before the earliest documented Egyptian king. So black Africans created the first kingship and pharaonic lineage in Africa in the Sudan generations before it was in Egypt. But they also introduced the pagan idolatry in that culture that included serpent worship, the very creature that was used as a medium to seduce the intellect of Eve. But it wasn't only in Africa. The Phoenician alphabet and its decipherment by the German Lutheran Orientalist Heinrich Gesenius is what opened the door to the deciphering of the Near Eastern script of ancient Babylon called cuneiform. But who founded Babylon, the culture of Sumer or Shinar? The United Kingdom produced a fine scholar who had a depth of intellectual thinking you don't get anymore, and he wrote a book called The Origin of Nations, documenting the founders of Babylon. George Rawlinson said, Nimrod and his people, which first set up a monarchy in Lower Mesopotamia and built or occupied the great cities of the alluvial plain, Babel or Babylon, Akkad, Erech or Oho, and Calno or Calno, were Cushites, a kindred race to the people of Ethiopia proper, and to various tribes scattered along the southwestern, southern, and eastern shores of the Arabian Peninsula. This has been seconded by a French professor, Assyriologist, and archaeologist, who also had a non-biased approach in observing the past, a rare quality in today's scholarship. He wrote a book titled Chaldean Astrology and Magic, and Francois Lenormand reiterated the words of George Rawlinson. He said that the Ethiopians, Sephians or children of Cush, which 3 names were given to them indifferently, who existed side by side with the Chaldeans proper, These Cushites founded the first political power in Chaldea, the empire of Nimrod or the king Cepheus, and there is no question of a Semitic invasion having supplanted them. When English Assyriologist Sir Austin Henry Layard was excavating the archaeological ruins of ancient Babylon in modern-day Iraq in the 19th century, the Arabs kept telling him that this is the land of Nimrod, and they not still left an impact on the Assyrian plains from when the co-prophet of Isaiah, Micah, wrote those words in the 8th century BC. According to Genesis chapter 10 verses 8 to 12, Nimrod ben Cush established himself as a powerful warrior king. Like the god Orion, who was titled after him, he was twice called a mighty hunter. The English word mighty is a translation of the Hebrew word Geber that means giant, so he was tall and huge in stature, and he was the first king, architect, land surveyor, community organizer who built a number of cities in the Near East. But in Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 to 9, we learn that this vast enterprise of his was an outright rebellion against God, the first attempt at a one-world government where God had to confound the languages. He was worshipped around the world, sometimes with the racial features of a black African, other times with just jet black skin, and that is why many blacks go on about a black man being worshipped as a god when they were just worshipping Nimrod. So from the best sources available, blacks laid the foundation of the two oldest civilizations on the planet. But from an ethical, spiritual perspective, both Egypt and Babylon are models of systems that are in rebellion against God in the book of Revelation. This stone artifact with Egyptian inscriptions on the sides has an image of the sun in the center. This Assyro-Babylonian monarch has the sun emblem, the cross, around his neck and one above his hand. This Babylonian cylinder has the sun god Shamash rising from the mountains and the goddess Ishtar, the queen of heaven, assisting him on the left. And on the right is the water god Ea or Enki, with a river of fish flowing from him. In Egypt, this coffin has a priest offering to the seated gods, and in the center is Nun, the personification of the primeval water abyss or the water god, transferring the bark of the sun at dawn into the arms of the sky goddess Nut. This earring of the goat is from ancient Sudan, but what did the worship of the goat represent? George Rawlinson says, another peculiar feature of the Egyptian religion, and one which, though it may have had some redeeming points, must be pronounced on the whole low and degrading, was the worship of live animals. Sheep, especially rams, were generally regarded as sacred, being emblems of Neph. Neph represented the creative mind. The esoteric Masonic writer Manly Palmer Hall said, when the vernal equinox no longer occurred in the sign of Taurus, the sun god incarnated in the constellation of Aries, and the ram then became the vehicle of solar power. The goat is both a phallic symbol and also an emblem of courage. When used in black magic, the pentagram is called the sign of the cloven foot, or the footprint of the devil. The star with the 2 points upward is also called the goat of Mendes, because the inverted star is the same shape as the goat's head. This goat seems to have been highly revered in ancient Babylon, but it was the astrological goat of Babylon on the right that impacted Babylon and still is in use today. But the deeper home of goat worship is in the Sudan, which is known as the home of the goat god. And this worship was later transferred to Egypt, where the goat was one of the highest revered deities. The half-goat, half-man nature deity Pan is just borrowed from Egypt. And while many believe that these are outdated and no longer existing, Satanists are reviving the worship of the goat god to a new generation. And this was reintroduced into Europe by French occultist Eliphas Levi. And the man who popularized it was American Satanist, the late Anton LaVey. Then in the UK, the religion of Wicca has Alexandrian Egypt rituals with the goat-headed priests in the background. And as you observe the rebellious rock culture, the goat god is still revered by the most famous artistes. And in Europe, eerie nature worship rituals also reintroduces the homage to the goat. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church. And when you walk inside, you see a continuation of the nature deities from Egypt and ancient Babylon, with the serpent horns coming out of its head. Cardinal John Henry Newman verified that paganism was sanctified and adopted by the Roman Catholic Church. And this artifact from ancient Babylon has the head of the most feared deity of Babylon up top, named Pazuzu, the Lord of the Ear. And in the center of the panel are men with a fish mitre that covers their body from head to toe. Here is a much larger one in the British Museum, with the fish head on the top and the scales covering the body. And all succeeding popes still wear the same fish mitre from ancient Babylon upon their head, which is a continuation of that system. And the cardinals also wear the same attire on their head. The Neo-Babylonian kingdom may have been overthrown in 538 BC, but its spirit is still alive. This Assyro-Babylonian monarch wears a mitre on his head with two tassels that run down to his back, with a golden cup in his hand. And this Bishop of Rome in St. John's Lateran Church also has a golden cup in his hand with the exact same mitre on his head, with the tassels coming down to his back. Scottish historian James Aiken Wiley said, "The papacy is a new Babel, in which the old redoubtable idolatries are the builders. It is a spiritual pantheon in which the local and vagrant superstitions find again a centre and a home. Analyze popery and you will find all these ancient systems in it." So the rebellious idolatrous system that Nimrod Ben Cush set up thousands of years ago still exists today after his death, fully embodied in the papacy. And if you don't study the past, you cannot understand the present. But the Black Cushites did not just spread Nimrod's religion in Africa and Asia. It spread even further. This Nubian or Black Cushite in the British Museum has a feather in his head, a common standard in ancient Sudan. This wall painting in Egypt dated to the 14th century BC shows Nubian Black Cushite chiefs in the front with the double feathers in their head that is symbolic of light and air, and it can be seen on the heads of Ra, Osiris and Amun-Ra. But how far did this spread? Here is an Egyptian queen, Ahmes Nefertari, also with the double or two feathers in her head. This Babylonian chief or king also is adorned with the double feathers in his head, which shows how far its influence spread. But even in North America, this native man, Tatanka Witko, also known as Full Bull, also has the double feathers in his head, which was common among the Brule, the Lakota American Indian people, and shows the similarities of cultures all over the world. But how did it spread into the Americas? Navigation is generally believed to be a modern phenomenon, and the general assumption is that the modern-day advanced technology has propelled mankind to conquer the globe. And Hollywood kind of reinforces this, where America promotes her naval warships in the film Battleship. Museums in the United Kingdom re-emphasize this point, and we generally believe that Captain James Cook, the 18th century British explorer, was the first to fully navigate the Pacific and Anzac Islands. But in Belgrave Square, that houses a number of foreign embassies in London, England, there is a statue of Christopher Columbus, the Italian explorer. But was he the first known European to land in the Americas? Leif Erikson was a Norwegian explorer who has been recently credited as reaching the Americas with his fellow Vikings 500 years before Columbus, where President Obama has dedicated a day to him. And evidence is now being unearthed that the Vikings and the indigenous people that Columbus mistakenly called Indians were already having an interaction between themselves, and archaeologists are unearthing these finds, but seafaring to the Americas still preceded the Vikings by thousands of years.
By crossing the Pacific for 5,000 miles, I will prove that Peruvians were the first to settle Polynesia.
It's further than from Chicago to Moscow.
Look around you. Every book in here offers some theory or another.
Mr. Hardo, doubtless the story of Norwegians drowning in the Pacific will sell a lot of magazines. But not this one.
You want your theory to be accepted? Then go ahead. Drift from Peru to Polynesia on a balsa wood raft.
There will be no one to save us out there, except your theory.
In the film Kon-Tiki, it covers the life of another Norwegian adventurer and ethnographer, the late Thor Heyerdahl. He wanted to challenge the established view of the Western educational system that naval travel inside the Pacific Islands and the Americas preceded Captain James Cook and Christopher Columbus. But what inspired him to do that? This artifact in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France is of a strange-looking head. In the British Museum there is one of a head and a body together. They both came from the Easter Island in the Pacific, and when he saw these enormous stone heads and some with bodies, he was intrigued on how this culture was able to carve these monuments, for they are huge, and he couldn't figure out how these men were able to move these huge blocks. So he went to Africa and made the natives of Chad make him a reed boat, and also a Peruvian, and he sailed from Africa into the Americas and documented it in a book called The Ra Expedition, and shattered conventional views. But more and more evidence is challenging how we view pre-Columbian travel. These artifacts from Egypt and the Americas shows a striking similarity in their headdresses, and these jaguar-adorned Mayan or Aztec priests, chiefs and kings look strikingly similar to the leopard or cheetah clothing of this Egyptian priest. Was there contact between these two cultures? The Fuente Magna Bowl was discovered at Lake Titicaca in Chile in South America, and it has cuneiform characters on it, a Proto-Sumerian language that has upset traditionalists. The Tennessee stone discovered has Phoenician inscriptions carved on it. The Phoenicians were known as great seafarers. An artifact was found in Mexico with features of a Caucasian man, and all these oopars or out-of-place objects are brushed to the side. But no one can seem to explain how Indians, Aryans, Chinese and Negroes are all in Monte Alban in Mexico, dated from 500 BC. No explanation is given. It is swept under the carpet. But there is a serpent-worshipping culture that left a very deep imprint on the culture of Mesoamerica in Mexico. Many are familiar with the Maya, Aztec and Zapotec cultures who built huge pyramids and famous for their ritual ball game. They would wear these heavy instruments around their waist, but their religion was very, very dark indeed. The Maya Aztecs believed in ancestor worship, where the ancestor would have the body of a serpent and the head of a man. The Maya Aztec also partook of the gross practice of bloodletting, where they would cut their tongue with a sort of barbed wire instrument and offer human blood to the gods. They had their own alphabetic script and counting system, a calendar that was divided into the religious and civil year, and they built pyramids whose mathematics and engineering skill still baffles archaeologists, historians and linguists in the West. But who laid the foundation for these pre-Columbian cultures? Time magazine records that more than 1,500 years before the Maya flourished in Central America, 25 centuries before the Aztecs conquered large swathes of Mexico, the mysterious Olmec people were building the first great culture of Mesoamerica. Starting in 1200 BC in the steamy jungles of Mexico's southern Gulf Coast, the Olmec's influence spread as far as modern Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. They built large settlements, established elaborate trade routes, and developed religious iconography and rituals including ceremonial ball games, bloodletting, and human sacrifice that were adapted by all the Mesoamerican civilizations to follow. They found these wheel toys in the Olmec culture, when the cultures of Mesoamerica are not meant to have even discovered the wheel. They found this image of a Olmec artifact holding a human heart. The late cardiologist Dr. Gordon Bodarski in the New York Times said the Olmecs had the oldest image of the human heart. What this cardiologist said was also verified in the Los Angeles Times. They also had the oldest writing system in the Western Hemisphere, around 3,000 years old, with the oldest glyphs and the bar and the dot calendar. But who are these people called the Olmecs? The late American ethnologist and archaeologist Matthew Sterling crouches next to a stone head of this culture. He said the features are clearly Negro. These heads are huge, and you can see how big they are when you measure it according to this woman who was standing on the left. They are roughly 6 to 8 feet tall, and the features are clearly black Kushite Africans. These are Nimrod's people, who spread his religion to the Americas and introduced a very highly cultured civilization, but also brought with them the dark practices of human sacrifice, the gross practice of bloodletting and ancestor worship. It is generally believed among most who are skilled in pre-Columbian studies that black Africans do not have the navigational skills to achieve such an accomplishment, though Thor Heyerdahl proved it. That's the common denominator that underlies the establishment view, but we have to look at the data and let the factual evidence explain itself. This skull was discovered in Brazil in South America, but on close inspection, Brazilian anthropologist Dr. Walter Neves said it differs from the morphological characteristics of typical Amarins, and in the New York Times in 1999, it said that the fossilized cranium has now been identified by Brazilian scientists as the oldest human remains ever discovered in the Western Hemisphere. Her features appear to be Negroid. She has been nicknamed Lucia, which is a Latinized form of Lucy. That was a name given to one of the oldest remains of a human skeleton that was discovered in Ethiopia. John Richard Archer, the first black mayor of London, England, had a keen interest in these black Kushite Africans who sailed into the Americas. He said that I am, and always will be, a race man. This feeling was born in me when quite a little boy in my natal city, Liverpool. The celebrated anthropologist in the Human Species strongly intimates that Africa had its share in the peopling and settlements of some sections of South America. He has been seconded by another researcher on this culture in a very, very rare book that is quite difficult to find called Unexpected Faces in Ancient America. Alexander von Wutenau, a German diplomat to the United States and later professor of Mexico art history, was analyzing artifacts from the Americas and realized that they had races from all over the globe. And this is what he said. There is at least good probability that the notorious Olmec rulers could claim as procurators some highly civilized Negroid people from Africa. Clearly, Negroid representations in America can be identified as early as 1200 to 500 BC, at least in terracotta and other materials known at present. This time would extend in the Old World from the reign of Ramses III and the later Libyan rulers in Tanis, Lower Egypt, to the epoch of the Ethiopian or Nubian domination of Egypt, including the 25th dynasty and the Negro king, Taharqa. So when studying history, we are led again to the king in the Bible, Taharqa. But even though he intervened between Assyria and Judah, he was still a Gentile who continued the idolatrous pagan religion of Nimrod by worshipping a falcon in the form of Horus. And though the kingdoms mentioned, all influenced by black African Kushites, spiritually declined as a result of their idolatry, it is very strange that a race of people still have a desire to go back to its pagan practices, and in their quest for a racial identity, they make war against the very person who died for them using all the arguments first presented by the men of the West. In the 2016 film Last Days in the Desert, starring British actor Ewan McGregor, it tries to reenact or distort what the Gospels actually said. It is an imagined chapter from Jesus' 40 days of fasting and praying in the desert, according to the IMDb, the world's most popular and authoritative source for movie, TV and celebrity content. And instead of Jesus having complete victory over Satan, the Lord is viewed as struggling with the devil over the fate of an ordinary family in crisis, setting himself a dramatic test with distinctly human conflicts, according to its official website. Many will argue and say, just chill, it's only artistic expression on celluloid. But remember that Hollywood is the world's most powerful and influential storyteller that has cleverly used the power of suggestion to completely undermine Jesus and subtly influence public opinion. And with today's generation having an unshakable faith in secular scientists, this gives them an invincibility over the minds of many, where they try to give a humanistic scientific explanation of Jesus' miracles. Time magazine had an article 10 years ago in 2006 titled God versus Science that said that brain chemists track imbalances that could account for the ecstatic states of visionary saints, or some suggest, of Jesus. If the narrator has read the whole article correctly, the scientists are suggesting that the Lord had some kind of chemical imbalance in his brain. A clever attempt to try to undermine his divine work, but it doesn't just stop there. According to the London Guardian newspaper, scientists claim that Jesus may have appeared to be walking on water when he was actually floating on a thin layer of ice, formed by a rare combination of weather and water conditions on the Sea of Galilee, according to a team of US and Israeli scientists. Oh Lord. So Jesus was walking on thin ice, making us believe that we can really rely on Israeli scientists to give a very balanced view on Jesus. That is so ridiculous. But while the arguments may look new, they can be traced to 12 leather-bound papyrus codices buried in a sealed jar dated to around the 2nd to 4th century AD that were discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, that belonged to a group who were a counter-movement to the apostolic faith, the Gnostics. In a book that summarizes Gnostic beliefs, the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Text and the Bible by Andrew K. Helmbold, it documents what scientists are now claiming. It reads that in fact the silence of the Gospel of Thomas, which has been proven a fraud, for example about sin, miracles, demons, etc., can be closely paralleled in modern Christian theologies. And the Gnostics replace leaning on divine support for humanism. The stress on self-knowledge rather than ethics or doctrine reminds one of modern movements not only in theology but also in psychology and psychiatry. These Gnostic attacks against Jesus' divinity, his birth, life, death and resurrection, and his work of restoring fallen man back into the image of God has also trickled into the black conscious mindset.
Jesus was born under strange circumstances, and she had to be put away privily, as the Bible teaches, because if she were seen pregnant, the law was, where's the husband? Where's the father? Well, you say Holy Ghost, but we know there's no human being born without the agency of a man. That's real.
Before he found the nation. Now, I'm no Muslim, but I agree with some of the things they say regarding black people. And if Allah helps to make him a better man than Jesus can, then I'm all for it.
I like messing with Christians, man. Because they easy to get. You can get on their skin quick, you know. Telling me Jesus died on the cross. I don't buy it. Jesus could feed 1,000 with a loaf of bread, walk on water, raise the dead. You telling me he couldn't handle 3 nails?
Black Jesus premieres Thursday, August 7th at 11.
Man, we can't front you no more, dog.
You do realize I died for your sins, right?
That was 2014 years ago.
Yeah, that's old.
Keep your white Jesus, don't pray to your crosses. They burning our churches. Crip, pass me the Uzi.
Hail Mary to the city, you're a virgin. And Jesus can't save you. Life starts when the church came here for school.
The rapper Jay-Z tells this young generation that Jesus can't save you. Life starts when the church ends. He holds the record for most #1 albums by a solo artist on the Billboard 200 chart, surpassing Elvis, so you can get a picture of his vast influence. And with this trend of celebrities attacking Jesus, you have to ask yourself, what do they believe in? And what are their affiliations? This photo shows Jay-Z on the second row in the center of a Masonic ceremony. While this may be a shock to some, this has been a trend among famous celebrities for years. The late Sun Ra was an American jazz composer, band leader, piano and synthesizer player who was very into ancient Egypt, as you can clearly see from his attire that he is wearing and by his stage name. And the London Guardian newspaper records that he and Duke Ellington and many of the top jazz musicians were Freemasons. And the narrator has been telling people for years that it is rare to reach those heights without being a member of some kind of secret society. The article continues that Sun Ra and Duke Ellington was joined by the likes of Nat King Cole, W.C. Handy, Dizzy Gillespie, Count Basie, Lionel Hampton and Paul Robeson. Why are they Masons? When the Afro-Guyanese historian George M. James, a Prince Hall Mason and professor at the University of Arkansas, wrote his influential book Stolen Legacy, Greek Philosophy, Stolen Egyptian Philosophy, he made explicit the connections between Freemasonry and Egyptology. For James, Egypt was the cradle of the mysteries and of the Masonic Brotherhood, while the Greek philosopher Socrates was merely a master mason and a brother initiate of the Egyptian mysteries, according to the London Guardian. The narrator decided to purchase his book many years ago, and it only follows the argument of Gerald Macy, as black conscious arguments have no originality, just borrowed from whites. And if you carefully read the writings of Herodotus and Manly P. Hall, they both tell you that the Greeks were initiated into the Egyptian mysteries, but they didn't steal anything, just continued Egyptian idolatrous paganism. So the evil eye, some call the all-seeing eye, has continued from Egypt into the West and can be seen in Roman Catholic churches throughout the world and also in Masonic temples all over the world. The Egyptian god Ptah, god of creation, art, fertility and of craftsmen, holds in his hand the Djed, which is called the backbone of Osiris. Today we would call it relic worship. And the icon for the most famous film awards, the Oscars, is holding the same symbol in his hand that represents the god Ptah. And the reason why the black conscious community go on and on about their stolen legacy, because when you are reading social media, they get enraged that whenever ancient Egypt is presented to the world by the entertainment industry, it always shows Northern Europeans who are playing the key roles. And the Great Pyramid, with its missing capstone, has become the insignia of the seal of the United States, and the birds on Egyptian coffins have also become the insignia of the seal of the United States. The home of modern Freemasonry is the United Kingdom, and it is not just celebrities, but the British royal family is heavily connected with Freemasonry. And those in the higher echelons in politics in the Anglo-Saxon world, such as successive US presidents, have been Masons. Not just those in the 20th century, but the founding fathers, who also structured the foundation of the United States, were Masons, starting with the very first president, George Washington. And during the time of the American Revolution, African-American Prince Hall also founded Black Freemasonry, with approval from the Grand Orient Lodge of Freemasonry in the United Kingdom. That is why most US blacks are members of Prince Hall Masonry. And because of its connection to ancient Egypt, more blacks are becoming sympathetic to Jay-Z, for they see Freemasonry as a branch of their African culture. And as they become more sympathetic to the occult mysteries, it will open more and more inroads into darkness that includes the satanic sex cult of Aleister Crowley, the OTO, where London's Daily Mail newspaper says Jay-Z is linked to. This is not far-fetched, for during the making of the music video Run This Town, Jay-Z proudly wears a hoodie with the mantra of heroin addict and occultist Aleister Crowley, "Do what thou wilt," the same message Satan told Eve in the Garden of Eden. Crowley, a proud Satanist's occult fascination was based upon the rituals of ancient Egypt, and this is why he will get more sympathy by the Black conscious movement. But are they fully aware of what they are getting into, and what is the aim of the occult? The best way to find out is by getting advice from an insider, and the late Freemason Manly Palmer Hall said, "The most dangerous form of black magic is the scientific perversion of occult power for the gratification of personal desire. Its less complex and more universal form is human selfishness, for selfishness is the fundamental cause of all worldly evil. A man will barter his eternal soul for temporal power, and down through the ages a mysterious process has been evolved which actually enables him to make this exchange. Though the demonism of the Middle Ages seems to have disappeared, there is abundant evidence that in many forms of modern thought, especially the so-called prosperity psychology, willpower building metaphysics, and systems of high-pressure salesmanship, black magic has merely passed through a metamorphosis, and although its name be changed, its nature remains the same. The mysteries, or secret societies, were therefore established. Why? For the purpose of unfolding the nature of man according to certain fixed rules, which, when faithfully followed, elevated the human consciousness to a point where it was capable of cognizing its own constitution and the true purpose of existence. So Manly Palmer Hall clearly tells us the root of secret societies, or the mysteries, and their overall aim: self-worship and a rejection of God that goes right back to the Garden of Eden over again. And this generation has been overfed with social media's so-called exposés of the occult and secret societies. They are totally unaware that while they may go on about men like Albert Pike, a 33rd degree Freemason, who said Lucifer is God, if you continue to be an atheist, humanist, existentialist, Marxist, evolutionary Darwinist, Kabbalist, Scientologist, spiritualist, Gnostic, who adheres to the knowledge of self-philosophy, or who partakes in yoga, a practice that goes back to the earliest phallic gods of India on the cylinder seals, where you invoke the serpent power in Shaktic and Tantric yoga by unleashing the goddess within, you are no different to the men who are performing rituals in secret societies, for you both consciously reject God and believe that the human heart has no need for him. It does not matter what you title it, it is all the same thing. And this is the same ideology of the Black conscious movement, where Jay-Z sports a chain or a group who adheres to the same pagan philosophy. They call themselves the 5%ers, or nations of gods and earths. And though they may not be as dominant or influential as they were in the 1990s, some of the biggest black artists in the United States are either members or adhere to their pagan philosophy. And when you compare their ideas with the ideas of the most influential scientists, as Manly Palmer Hall says, its name may be changed, but its nature remains the same.
Some part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
The
Because everything in the universe, God, that's created the universe, God, exists within you. You see what I'm saying? And that's the mind that you can't see.
So you mean tell me I'm made of all this right here?
You the creator of all this.
Right.
Because all these things must happen. It must take place. See, people would go back in the day, God, and say, yeah, well, one man, one woman, Adam and Eve. It ain't no such thing. Everything you see always has been and always will what be.
The hip-hop group the Wu-Tang Clan are all staunch adherents of the 5% Nation philosophy that is exactly as the same self-worship of the late cosmologist Carl Sagan. But who introduced the self-worship philosophy to the black community? The US Domestic Intelligence and Security Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, better known as the FBI, has a number of declassified files on Wallace Ford Muhammad, a mysterious individual who was renowned as a criminal according to the files of the FBI. He was described as a white male, a New Zealander, around 5'8", 140 pounds, black eyes, beautiful even teeth, straight nose, and Caucasian features. These are the rare photos of Mr. Wallace D. Fard, a Caucasian who used to go to poor black neighborhoods, knock on doors, and teach them a very strange philosophy. And one of his followers, before he rejected his ideas, documented his ideas in his autobiography. And Malcolm X said, in Detroit in 1931, Mr. Muhammad met Master W. D. Fard. He said that he was born into the Quraysh tribe of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the Arabian prophet himself. No heaven was in the sky, Mr. Fard taught. Mr. Fard taught that as hell was on earth, also on earth was the devil, the white race, which was bred from black original man 6,000 years before, purposely to create a hell on earth for the next 6,000 years. The black people, God's children, were gods themselves, Master Fard taught. That's foolishness. So a man the FBI has described as a white Caucasian male comes out of nowhere, teaches black people these ideas, and they embraced it without checking its clarity. Wow. In a book titled God, Earth and 85ers by Penn Black, it documents a man who ran with these ideas and shaped the thinking of many in the hip-hop community. The nations of gods and earths evolved from the teachings of Clarence 13X Smith. He taught not to have a belief in an invisible God, but to believe in yourself. He taught not to look for magical help, but to help yourself. When you study this serpent-inspired Garden of Eden philosophy, it sounds strikingly similar to the ideas of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and what he wrote in his Zarathustra, an attack on Jesus Christ. Nietzsche's opposition to Christianity is not confined to its otherworldliness, which he considered a mere symptom. In Zarathustra's prologue, remain faithful to the earth and do not believe those who speak to you of other worldly hopes.
You've been educating people for years on the power and fighting the power. What do you think is the biggest source of power in the world today?
The biggest source of power, and I think, Griff could probably attest this, knowledge of self and knowledge of your surroundings.
This is the same philosophy as Clarence 13X, who also said, spirituality is the feeling of connectedness towards one's origin of creation. People need no middleman for spirituality. The creative energy present everywhere in the universe can be reached on an individual basis. Who is this middleman? It is Jesus Christ, and Clarence 13X encourages people to reject his death and his current intercession for us as our high priest. But what about this creative energy? Alice Bailey says, the new age is upon us, in which man will begin to use his divine power and come into closer touch with the spiritual sources of all life. The work of the new religion will be the distribution of spiritual energy. And many influentials in the black conscious community are promoting this Alice Bailey philosophy. No matter what is the color of the skin, they teach the same thing.
Hip-hop is first our collective way of thinking and being that has no form, has no shape. It's not even here in material reality. It's just the way we think, our collective consciousness. Most spiritual people never test their spiritual abilities. They live in a universal mind, but never ask the universe for anything. Anything you do in the universe, it is instantly doing it to you.
We teach that black people are the original people on the planet Earth. We teach that the black man is God and proper name is Allah, arm, leg, arm, head. Same as WD, Fard.
Because the black man is God. And No Way Out 2, that's how I'm going to leave it on you. Peace.
The influence of the 5% lessons can be heard in the music of some of today's most popular recording artists, groups like Brand Nubian, Wu-Tang Clan, Poor Righteous Teachers, Digital Planets, and The Roots, also Rakim, Busta Rhymes, Common, Guru, Pete Rock and CL Smooth. Others such as Erykah Badu, Lauryn Hill, Nas, AZ, and Queen Latifah have had some 5% influences. So the self-worship philosophy of the 5% nation has influenced modern urban music. But in order to get to the root of the psychology of the black conscious mind, we have to look at a man who has been its strongest influence. Marcus Mosiah Garvey helped to strengthen the Harlem Renaissance, a revival of black arts and entertainment. He inspired and was praised by many black leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, whose parents Earl and Louise Little were staunch Garveyites. The Black Panther Party and their 10-point program and free breakfast program was inspired by Garvey. In the Caribbean, in Garvey's homeland Jamaica, the Rastas were founded on his philosophy. And the Black Hebrews of Harlem were also working with Garvey when he was alive. We shall carefully look at this man and his philosophy. And remember, as always, please research everything that is presented in this study. Feel free to subscribe to the Even at the Doors YouTube channel, where you'll receive regular videos. And you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links below. I would just like to thank all those who have sent donations that have kept this ministry afloat. And if you would like to continue to support this work, also click on the link below. If you would like to see this work spread even further, you have permission to distribute this video for non-commercial or commercial use on the condition that you do not add or take away from the content of this study. Thank you.